Hey there friends, my name is Jim and today I'd like to talk about Putin and his plan. So the media would like you and me to believe that Putin has finally lost his marbles. Why would he invade Ukraine? They're at peace, right? Sure, you heard about Putin increasing his troops at the borders, but that's just your run-of-the-mill warmongering, so often repeated that it's basically meaningless. But no, this time it is actually for real, and you have no idea why. Well, I won't leave you alone in this slog of Western war propaganda. Come with me and I'll actually explain how this is the fault of who else but the good old US of A. Before we get started, guys, I just wanted to let you know that my channel lives on the word of mouth of you guys alone. YouTube does not like me and it does not put me up in the algorithm, so please copy the URL of this video, send it to a friend, like, share, subscribe, go to my website at jimmyjams.xyz for all of my content, and let's get into the video. So if you haven't noticed, the rhetoric around war has gotten a little bit more heated in the moment, with Zelensky calling for the US to put a no-fly zone around Ukraine, which would mean that once Russian planes were to go into Ukraine, we would shoot them down and we would officially be at World War III with Russia. Now, what most of us see the Ukraine conflict as is a very, very sad thing that will lead to a lot of probably refugees coming from Ukraine into Europe and into America, and that's a bummer. But none of us are going to die over Ukraine being in or out of the Western sphere of influence. Now, who would want us to die for Ukraine being in or out of the Western sphere of influence? Our leaders, because for the longest time they have thought themselves outside of the common problems of hot war because they thought they'd designed a system that completely alleviated that problem. It was their belief that creating NATO and isolating places like Russia and China would lead them to becoming much weaker areas that we could manipulate, much like we manipulate France or Germany or literally every other country in the world except for Israel. And the UK to some extent. Us three are in a conglomeration to basically control the entire world, and it looks like Putin is finally saying, no. You guys can pretend to have that fake world over there, but I'm gonna stand up and make my own rules, and China's got my back too. You guys don't really have much of a say. So with all this rhetoric heating up and the possibility of us getting actually into a hot war with Russia, I wanted to break down exactly why this is a stupid idea that was pushed by the United States for the United States oligarchs, and why the Ukrainian president is nothing but a puppet actor who specifically was plucked out of obscurity and put into his position of power for an instance like this. So, since Putin crossed the border into Ukraine, the United States has decided once again to insert itself into the middle of a conflict that it has nothing to do with, claims not to have started, and for reasons that are not totally clear. For some reason, the same people who claim America's policing the world has turned generations of peaceful Muslims into horrible angry terrorists for killing their families have been absolutely wetting their pants with indignity over the fact that we haven't yet glassed Russia off the face of the map. If you give a cursory glance to the Western media and propaganda dispensary known as the internet, you can find an almost endless cavalcade of social scientists, Twitter blue checks, and think tank intelligentsia political types repeating the never-ending mantra that's been pushed for the last, 5 years now. Putin is the new Hitler. Which is somewhat ironic because in this particular conflict, Putin has claimed that part of the reason for the special operation in Ukraine is removing the more National Socialist-y elements from Ukraine's military and government. Officially, he calls this the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine for the safety of Russia. And no, before you ask, that's not just propaganda that was made up from whole cloth as a justification for invading. There actually is a pretty well-documented record of individuals and groups in Ukraine showing respect and admiration to the ideas of National Socialism, and certainly for the insignia of what you would call the Nazi aesthetic. However, it's of some interest to note that the most extreme of the groups, the Azov Battalion, is ran and funded by a Ukrainian billionaire named Igor Kolomoyskyi, who also happens to be the head of the United Jewish Community of Ukraine, and later became president of the entire European Council of Jewish Communities. He was kicked out of that for some reason or another and went on to form another Jewish European group, but either way, what I mean to say here is he's funding this battalion, but he also has major incentive to work for the benefit of Israel and Ukraine, or Jews in Ukraine, or Jews around the world, because that is his group.
And he's also a longtime friend and supporter of President Zelensky, who, of course, the Azov Battalion is happy to fight for, who is also Jewish and made the Jewish prime minister, which leads me to think the whole National Socialist part of it is maybe more the aesthetic, the vibe, the nationalism, and not so much the, like, incessant hatred for the international Jewry or whatever. Still, here in the United States, if a politician comes in with 100 miles of a swastika, they're labeled enemy number one with the same types of people who are now screaming their heads off for Putin to be taken down for invading a country that most of them couldn't point out on a map. It's curious, isn't it? Anyway, this looks like it could be the big one. You know, the happening you've been waiting for since middle school started programming you to think the end of the world was coming. You know, the whole World War Z, you know, COVID idea that you had a couple of years ago. Maybe COVID would turn into the zombie plague. Well, now, oh, that's out of that chapter. Let's go for World War III and the nuke blowing up the world. Basically, the story of the world's been incredibly stable since the end of World War II. The entire planet was living in a relatively peaceful era where, from the consideration of the Western elites, war just wouldn't happen anymore. And they believed that they had set everything up in such a way that open warfare would be a thing of the past and basically impossible. The United States, the UK, and Israel were the three branches of the stool that they sat on to milk the cow of the world completely dry for the rest of history. The borders were set, and all they had to do is just basically skim the cream off the top of the financial markets while the lower classes of their respective domains would keep the gears of global capital turning. Unfortunately for them, instead of nurturing their nations and making sure that they could defend themselves if the need ever arose, they decided to milk even more profit out of the system by indoctrinating their own people with their propaganda and feeding them their poison, making them sick and stupid and lazy, while those that they had dismissed into the trash bin of history were slowly gaining their strength and biding their time. And it seems like they're finally making their move. But going back a bit, just so that you understand how this all started, NATO was an agreement made between the West European countries and their allies like the US back right after World War II to make sure that communism didn't keep spreading further west into Europe and like places that were our allies, France, Germany, England. In 1948, everybody signed the agreement that basically said that if anybody were to attack any single one of the allies in the group, all of the group would attack that nation together. It was pretty much a permanent creation of the whole Axis and Allies idea. Now, after a whole bunch of crazy history where NATO almost plunged the world into nuclear annihilation several times, we actually won, and in 1991 the USSR dissolved. But like most of these wartime powers, wartime agreements, things like that, it made its goal happen. It dissolved the USSR, but it didn't quite want to disappear, because the goal of NATO clearly wasn't trying to move into a bright new shiny world with Russia in a global partnership to skip off together into the sunlight. Like everything else that the US gets involved in, it became a draconian tool to expand the American sphere of influence as close to Putin's borders as we could justify. Indeed, a lot of the rhetoric leading up to the invasion of Ukraine was about whether or not Ukraine should be invited to join NATO leading up to the invasion. To you and me, if we see something in the news saying Ukraine wants to join NATO, it flies right above our heads. We don't care. Ukraine, NATO, I know what NATO's that agreement thing, Ukraine's a country over there, whatever, what do I care? But to Putin and to Russia as a whole, this is just adding insult to historical injury. You see, even just keeping NATO existing in Europe after the Cold War was kind of a compromise with Russia. When the US Secretary of State James Baker visited Mikhail Gorbachev, who was in charge of Russia back in the 90s, or early 90s, 1991, to discuss the upcoming changes with NATO, he said, quote, "If you abolish NATO, there will be no more U.S. presence. We understand the need for assurance to the countries in the East. If we maintain a presence in Germany that is part of NATO, there would be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction of forces of NATO 1 inch to the east." And a lot of people take this quote and say when they said we're not going to go 1 inch to the east, they were talking about Germany. They weren't talking about Eastern countries in the Eastern Bloc. But that completely that betrays a complete lack of historical knowledge, because at this point, it was still the Soviet Union. They weren't planning on becoming different countries. This whole agreement was specifically in order to keep Germany from plopping back up. The United States was there to keep Germany down, but NATO became a tool to keep Russia as a weak, easily defeatable enemy after they became their new nation again. So from the very beginning of US-Russia relationships, there was a lot of the top US officials plainly stating that NATO was mostly a formal excuse for the US to remain in Europe. Clearly, we're no longer worried about the spread of communism, and whether we should be or not is a completely different conversation, because McCarthy was right. But what was our reasoning for having NATO at all after that, like from our point of view? Clearly, the US is worried that Russia wouldn't just follow our cues with regards to globalization, and so we've used our relationship with smaller, more easily manipulated countries to bully them into doing our bidding. Think about it. What has Russia done that makes it enemy number one against the eyes of the American government? Can you think of anything? Well, we claim that they somehow messed with the integrity of our elections, but all the evidence we have ever seen is just state-sponsored trolling, basically setting up farms of people to argue with Americans and get the Americans to argue with each other. Literally every country does that to every other country, so I'm not sure whether that makes them particularly evil there. We claim Putin's committed war crimes in Syria because he killed 440 civilians, when our Secretary of State justifies the deaths of 500,000 innocent children for war profits thusly.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
But those kind of war heroes, who needs war criminals? Ha cha cha. Yes, believe it or not, that was Volodymyr Zelensky doing a dance in his comedy show. He was for quite a while a comedian. In fact, up until, I believe, 2013, he was a comedian, when he was plucked from his television show in order to become the president of Ukraine. What did he do in his sitcom television show, you ask? Well, it was called Servant of the People, and he was the president of Ukraine. What channel was that on? Well, let me take a real quick look here. Who owns the channel? It was on 1x1 Media, and it was owned by the same guy who bankrolled the Azov Battalion. Well, that's a little bit of a coincidence, isn't it? There's Ukrainian oligarchs working with leaders in the military to install somebody who is more favorable to the West. All of a sudden, a war breaks out, and whose side are we on but the person who is favorable to the West? Russia thought that their sphere of influence was shifting, and so they said that no, you can't have NATO directly in my backyard. You can't tell us what to do. You can't tell me that I can't have missiles on my border, yet right on the other side of my border have missiles pointed directly at me. That's not how this whole thing works. You're the United States, stay over there and deal with that. I'm Russia, I'll deal with my own stuff. Basically, imagine if, I don't know, Texas and California had seceded from the United States, and we decided to go and forcefully take them back from Mexico. And then we just decided to take Mexico totally as it is. Do you think Russia would have a problem with that? Do you think Russia would have anything to do with any of that? No, because that's not their business, because we're not under their sphere of influence. They don't get to decide what we are doing. Yet, in this situation, when they have a territory that was taken from them in 1991, it basically fell apart. That territory stayed independent for a good long time, and all of a sudden, when the US decides to start pushing missiles directly into that territory, they decide to take it back? This is the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse, but we're pretending that Russia did something wrong. We're pretending that Russia provoked all this. We are pretending that us pushing and pushing and pushing that border of NATO further and further and further closer to Putin was just never going to have an impact? Well, guess what? You just cut them off from Visa and MasterCard, and now Putin and China have begun to start their own international finance committee. So what you've done is completely fracture the reality that you thought you had, where there was never going to be another big, hot military war in the world. You just turned that button back on because you couldn't nurture and you couldn't control what you had. You thought you'd be able to just sit on your laurels and keep all of that power to yourself without ever worrying about how the foundation of that power continues to grow. When you break the foundation, when you break the family, when you destroy the very pieces that put your nation together, and then you want to use all that power to attack your enemies, guess what? That power is not there anymore. So when our oligarchs decide that Russia's oligarchs need to be sanctioned against, the only reason that they are sanctioned against is because our mafia is bigger than theirs. We need to stop pretending that this is some moral thing where we are deciding that Ukraine is in the right because Ukraine is somehow just better. We are doing bad things to Russia. Russia's retaliating in kind, and we are calling them the aggressor. If you believe that Ukraine deserves independence, which I don't know where I stand on that war. I'm not historically literate enough to make that call. But if you think that you are, I suggest that you take a real hard look on where you're getting your information and whether or not the bias towards the West and the US isn't making you just start thinking crazy things that aren't actually there. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, your word of mouth gets these out, so please like, share, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you think. If I'm completely wrong about this, splash this all over somebody. Let me know how wrong I am. I might be wrong. But one thing I know is that the elites certainly aren't happy with Russia, and that almost makes me want to back them just out of contrarianism. But till next time, guys, peace.